This is Luke Broyles with 21st Century Finance, and today I want to answer the simple question, why is Bitcoin so hard to understand? This isn't an argument for Bitcoin or against Bitcoin. It's not an explanation of what Bitcoin is even. It's simply answering that question of why is it so hard to understand if it has any potential of being the future? Why is it hard to explain? Why is it hard for people to comprehend? Why is it difficult to articulate? And why is it hard for people of all sorts of backgrounds, whether they're educated, uneducated, whether they're politicians or bankers or people in the media or just regular everyday people? Why is it so difficult to explain, or at least explain the arguments for it? This is one of the questions I ask myself the most often, as well as one of the questions I am asked the most often. And the simple answer is that attempting to explain any superior technology to a society running on an inferior or an old or outdated technology is extremely difficult. And I think one of the best examples is one of the earliest ones of fire. Most of us don't really think of fire as a technology, but really we can think of it in that regard for this example. If you try to explain to a group of humans that have never seen fire, never used fire, touched fire, the importance of fire, how it works, or what it could do to their society, or how it could upgrade their society, you simply can't explain it to them. They aren't going to get it. You can explain it to them in 100 different ways, but they simply are not going to understand it. If we could just place ourselves in their shoes for a moment and envision what their life looked like without fire, and then if we could just think about the amazing transformation that would occur once fire was introduced to their society, say from a neighboring tribe or village, it simply would be an upgrade that we can't even fathom to their lives. They go their whole lives having to hunt, food spoiling very quickly, food being raw constantly, full of diseases and everything, and all of a sudden we give them this promise of this magical yellow-orange substance that can make their food more nutritious, make it less perishable, and not only that, but it's also a weapon of war. You can defend yourself better against enemies, you can use it to scare off predators, you can use it to compete with other tribes, you can light your arrows with it. Really, the implications are endless here. It's a form of technology that, even though it's as simple as just fire, an element of nature, something humans didn't even create, it is such a radical transformation that you can't explain it to them. Their brains simply are not able to wrap their head around it because they've never seen anything like it before. And if we take another example, not just fire, but what fire can light, say gunpowder, you simply can't explain it to somebody who has never seen it before. Versus by the time it's been invented. You know, if you're trying to explain to a general warfare after the invention of gunpowder, you simply can't explain it to them. You know, if a society is using spears and bows and arrows, you can't explain the technological superiority of an 18th century cannon. Even though it's primitive technology by today's standards, it is so far beyond the technology of these folks of the pre-gunpowder era, pre-black powder. They simply can't picture what that world could possibly look like. And an important side note here is that once the cannon is invented and once black powder and gunpowder become frequent across the world, it's really it becomes very paramount for national security, statehood security of every nation and empire and colony to acquire that substance, to acquire that technology for their own self-preservation and for their own defense. Just as with the civilizations competing over fire, the civilizations competing over cannons, or today with, say, nuclear weapons, once it is invented, everybody needs it. Everybody needs this new technology, and to not upgrade to this new technology is to cease to exist. If you are still using stones when everyone else is using spears, your society will stop to exist. If you're using fire and your neighbors are not using fire, they will cease to exist as a society. It's simply the brutal nature of technology, whether in warfare or in economics. It is a fight that is never ending. It is always constant. And if we go to one of my favorite examples, personally, that of the locomotive, and one of the reasons it's my favorite is because it was so recent. You know, most of us, fortunately, have been able to meet people in their 80s and their 90s, or perhaps even 100 years old, and the wide adoption of the locomotive really was barely 200 years ago. And so, really, we're in this incredibly incredibly short period of history of the locomotive. For thousands of years, the horse was the fastest method of transportation for humans across the entire world, and the locomotive was the complete undermining of that paradigm. It fundamentally changed the entire world. It was one of the most important moments in human history, where you could traverse long distances. It was the first mass transit system, it was a weapon system, and it was a method of mass trade and trading of surplus commodities, which inevitably led to the Industrial Revolution. And so if we were trying to explain to somebody that for thousands of years, both them and their parents, their grandparents, and 100 generations before them are used to horses and oxen and muscles, using muscles to power their farms and their farmland, you simply can't explain the Industrial Revolution to them, and you simply cannot explain the locomotive that gives the kickstart to that Industrial Revolution. You can't explain what this world would look like. It's not a matter of these people being any less intelligent than you. In all reality, they're probably even smarter than we are, because they're probably far healthier than we are in some regards, but you simply can't explain it to them. For example, with the locomotive, people back in those days would race horses with trains to prove the horse's superiority and how it could still go faster than these locomotives, and all these people would laugh and mock at these primitive forms of the train and of the steam engine as inferior, and that the horse was still reigning superior, and that maybe someday the steam engine would catch on, but not nearly to the degree that we, obviously looking backwards in history, can see, and they simply could not have envisioned it. It would have sounded ludicrous to claim that a train could go just as fast as a horse, let alone faster than a horse, 10 times as farther for 1/10 the cost. It's simply inconceivable. People thought that if you rode on a train and it went any faster than the horse, you would die from asphyxiation. They thought it would be far too expensive. They thought it would be only a pastime for the rich. As you can see with this picture here, most of the people riding in this primitive train are of the upper class, and so it was viewed as a luxury, as a pastime, not something for mass transit. In fact, mass transit wouldn't have even been an idea at the time, because there was nothing to be mass transit, and so really the point here is that no matter the form of technology, it is simply inconceivable to understand. And this is one of my favorite pictures regarding the locomotive, simply because of the context of this picture. As late as the 1820s, to a quote I'll get to in just a moment, that the locomotive was viewed as more or less absurd in the eyes of many, many people, even experts. And this photo here in 1869 is the Golden Spike in Utah of the closure of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. And not only is it amazing that this picture is mere decades after the locomotive as a mass transit system was viewed as absurd, but at the same time, this picture is taken just under 100 years after, 100 years before we landed on the moon. So the difference in time between 1869 with this picture and landing on the moon in 1969 is just over 100 years. I think it's roughly 100 years and 3 or 4 months or something, just barely a century. We went from the finishing of construction of the Transcontinental Railroad to landing on the moon. That's something quite amazing to realize. And if you were to go back to the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and explain to these people that this locomotive is such a big deal that in just a mere 150 years, we'll be putting people on the moon and have technology you can't even conceive of today, it would seem pretty ridiculous. And this curve of exponential adoption is only getting faster as a function of time. If you were to go to somebody, even as recent in 1995, and try to explain to them how your life is different from theirs, they simply would not believe it. If you were to try to explain to them Zoom or Amazon or all these tech companies and all these forms of communication that we have today, they simply wouldn't understand it. You can't explain it to them. One of the most infamous clips of this exact phenomenon is Bill Gates explaining to David Letterman in 1995 the internet. Perhaps you've already seen this, but I think it's worth a watch to make the point clear.
What about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage. Companies are there. The latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
Yeah, but it's easy to criticize something you don't fully understand, which is my position here.
Go ahead.
But I can remember A couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell? You know what I mean?
There's a difference.
There is a difference.
It's not a huge difference.
What?
And now, obviously, we do know that there is a huge difference between radio and the internet. Radio, probably the vast majority of people never use a radio. In fact, I would dare say the majority of people don't have a radio, and probably my generation, Gen Z, most of us will never own a radio, never have owned a radio, and yet when it comes to the internet, most of us are using the internet 5, 10, 15 hours a day, whether we realize it or not. We have multiple computers and devices that use the internet virtually 24/7. The internet is an indispensable part of technology from our lives, even though this is not even 30 years ago. The rate of change is simply dramatic. And I don't show this clip to make fun of David Letterman or the audience for laughing at the internet, considering it a laughable idea. The whole point here is to say that, given these quotes here as well, which I won't read, but you can get the idea, is that all these forms of technology are laughable and absurd to people that have not seen it yet, simply because our brains aren't ready to comprehend it. And so, likewise with Bitcoin, if Bitcoin is a piece of technology and you're going to try to attempt to explain it to a banker, a regular everyday consumer, or a politician, what Bitcoin is going to do to society, the ramifications of it, you simply can't successfully explain it to them unless they're willing to put in the work and attempt to explain it themselves. For example, if we take Bill Gates here, who we just heard from a moment ago talking about Bitcoin, we can see how his tune is quite different here.
It's kind of a pure greater fool theory type investment. So, you know, I agree. I would short it if there was an easy way to do it. What are they?
So his tune's very different there, clearly. And this is to make fun of Bill Gates. He was a incredible visionary with the internet, but simply does not understand Bitcoin yet. And Bill, if you're watching this, which I think is an extremely low probability, you can short Bitcoin. So I encourage you to put your money where your mouth is and short Bitcoin, although I don't think it's going to work out for you very well at all. And so it's not that any of these people, Bill Gates or other folks that I was mentioning earlier in these earlier quotes over here, it's not that these people are stupid, incompetent, or unread. They're all very smart, far smarter than me, I would dare say. You know, if we were to go back, you know, some of these people were visionaries of their time. You know, Charlie Chaplin, for example, was one of the most famous people of this era of filmmaking, and he even thought that it was a fad at one point. Or Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, or even Warren Buffett, who is a very admirable investor, who's also in this clip over here with Bill Gates. You know, these folks don't understand Bitcoin, not because that they lack intelligence or that they're incompetent or unread. They're far smarter than you and I. They're far richer than you and I. And it's not a matter of intelligence. It's simply that their brains aren't ready. They aren't adapted yet. We can't evaluate a system from within a system. And this is not talking about a monetary system. This is talking about a technological system. If you don't use a smartphone, you can't understand the significance a smartphone is going to have in your life, because you can't envision yet what all these apps are going to look like and what life is going to look like in the future. You can't evaluate one piece of a coming system from within the systems that make the current paradigm function, because you're basically you're comparing apples to oranges. These things are not compatible. If we're going to go back to the horse and the locomotive, I'm sure if you were to travel back in time and ask these people about the locomotive, they might say, oh, perhaps someday in the future we'll use the locomotive for long distance travel and the horse will retain for short distance travel. The horse is not going anywhere. And today this is a laughable opinion. It simply does not make sense. And the argument here clearly falls apart, because these are not compatible systems. You cannot have a global mass transit system backed on the locomotive as well as the horse. You can't have metallic power and muscle power both be the backbone of global transportation. You might think that the horse will continue to survive in certain niches, but that's simply not going to happen. The automobile is going to eventually take over shorter term distances, and the airplane through air travel, which we can't even picture, or those people would not have been able to picture. And so if we assume, for example, that the horse is a permanent factor of life because it's lasted for the last few thousand years, we're going to always assume that what is coming, in this case the locomotive, will seem absurd. We can't picture future technology in our current paradigm. And probably one of the more everyday examples is the light bulb. If we're going to try to explain to somebody who slaughters whales to light their home, light their lamps with whale oil, if we're going to try to explain to them how a light bulb works, they simply aren't going to understand it, because you have to understand what a light bulb is. You have to explain the glass, the manufacturing, the tungsten filaments. All these things are incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult, borderline impossible for people of these former societies to do. And then you have to explain electricity, what electricity is, how it goes through wires. You have to explain the electromagnetic spectrum. You have to explain nuclear reactors and solar panels and oil wells and all these other forms of generating and transporting electricity across space and time. Simply put, these people would think you are absolutely insane that a light bulb would ever become more efficient than just going out, killing a whale, and burning the oil you get from that. They would say it is so expensive, so ludicrous, it's never going to happen. And yet, at the time, it was merely half a century or a few decades away. And so if we think of our own lifetime with the internet and smartphones, it took years for our brains to adapt and understand this exponential pace of technology, because our brains are on linear thinking. We simply aren't ready for the ways that technology changes our brain, and it changes our brains faster than our brains can keep up with it. And it's not that we are unintelligent, it's just that we are not adapted for this. We are inherently very, very bad at predicting technology, because we're trained to expect the status quo. We're trained to expect future technology will be built upon the backbone of current technology. And we expect this because the way of physics, chemistry, and the laws of nature don't change overnight. We expect everything to remain the constant from the world we're born up and grow into versus today. This is why, for example, younger people are much better at using smartphones and technology than older people. It's because younger people, this is the status quo we've been born into. And so we grow up assuming this is the way the world is, even though intellectually we can identify that it's not. It is built into the wiring of our brain that it is inherently difficult to understand. And this is why all technological adaptation is difficult, because it's exponential. And so this is fundamentally why Bitcoin is so hard to explain, and why it seems that Bitcoiners are in their own world. I've heard people call it religion, an obsession, whatever you want to call it. It's not a religion, it's not a cult, it's not an obsession, it's simply a piece of technology. And the Bitcoin folks who are extremely confident and have conviction in it simply see a world in which people today cannot see. And you might think that's right, you might think that's wrong, but that's the crux of the argument here. It's not because we don't know we're annoying. We're fully aware that we're annoying and seem quite insane to people that don't see it yet, even though we try to be as reasonable sounding as we possibly can. It simply can't sound reasonable. You simply can't have it sound plausible to people that aren't thinking in that way. And so fundamentally what I believe personally, is that Bitcoin works, it's irreplaceable, and there's never going to be a second version of Bitcoin like the current version of Bitcoin, which I won't get into why I believe that here. That would be a far longer video. But secondly, that because it works, its domination of every asset class in every corner of the world is inevitable. In the same way that fire's domination globally is inevitable, and the light bulb and every other form of technology, Bitcoin likewise is going to become mainstream in ways that we can't even picture yet. And then every entity that doesn't adopt Bitcoin in the next given period of years will face extreme challenges. And this is not to be a fearmonger. This is just to state the brutal truth. If I were to go back in time 30 years and tell everybody that if you don't adopt the internet in the next say 20 years or so, your company's going to go bankrupt, your country's going to fall behind, and you're going to be a social outcast. People would think that that's fear-mongering, that that's absurd. And it's not intended to be that way. It's just intended to be a harsh but brutal truth that if you don't adapt with the times and if you don't keep up with the technology, even if you decide not to use it, you are going to fall behind. It's not a matter of people intentionally excluding you. It's just a matter that you won't be able to catch up. Again, if we go back to the idea of the canon, if your country decides not to use the canon, your country basically is going to cease to exist because you're not going to be able to keep up. It's not a matter of you being rude. It's just a matter of brutal truth that you won't be able to keep up. And likewise with Bitcoin, the argument is that Bitcoin makes all other financial and monetary instruments irrelevant because it's a superior piece of technology. And if that's true, you basically need to pay attention to this. And simply put, everything that has a price is going to zero against Bitcoin. And I know that sounds like an extremely absurd, rash, and irrational claim to people, but that is the claim of Bitcoin. Yes, everything, really, all your stocks, all your bonds, all your cash, it's all going to zero against Bitcoin, and it's all going to zero probably sooner than you expect. We don't know how many years it's going to take. We don't know how long. I don't know how long. Anyone that says they know exactly how long is completely absurd, but it is almost certainly going to be shorter than you expect. And I won't get into that here, but basically Bitcoin's adoption, not its price, its adoption is growing 80% faster than the internet. So if you were to think about how greatly a degree the internet has changed your life in the last 20 years, basically think of Bitcoin as growing 80% faster than that on an annual rate. So my encouragement to you is to accept that Bitcoin is a piece of technology. Either it works or it does not work, or it can be replaced. One of those three options. And nothing else matters besides this question here. If it works, if it doesn't work, ignore the price, ignore every other argument about it. Either it is a superior piece of technology that works, or it is an inferior piece of technology that doesn't work, or it can be replaced. Okay, that's the only question that matters. Everything else is noise. That's the only question you should be asking yourself. No other questions, okay? Second of all, in order to find the answer to that question, I encourage you to be curious and take a second look. That the claims that are made, like the claim I just made that everything else is going to zero, it is so absurd, so ridiculous, and so crazy that those claims either have to be insane or correct. And, likewise, when I first heard those claims years ago, I thought that it was completely absurd, completely bogus, and I wrote it off. And I regret that because I should have taken a second look and realized that, hey, these are smart people. They might be aware of something that I'm not seeing yet, and I should take that second look. And so that's my encouragement to you. Take the second look, take the benefit of doubt, and try to prove them wrong, which is the third argument here, or the third encouragement for you. Try to prove them wrong. Try to show for yourself, for them, for others, why these arguments are incorrect. And I think you'll be amazed how quickly and how easily it is possible to destroy the arguments against Bitcoin, and you'll be shocked how resound the case for Bitcoin is. And on a personal note, I thought Bitcoin was a scam for 4 years. I thought it was a Ponzi scheme. I thought it was a speculative bubble. And now I'm shocked I ever thought that. And it's not because I was dumb. It's not because that you're dumb if you don't understand it yet. It's not a matter of intelligence, the reason why people don't get it. It's just a matter of technology. And we have a very difficult time understanding new forms of technology and new paradigms. And this is why if you were to go back in time and debate your former self, you simply would destroy them, whether we're talking about the internet or Bitcoin or the locomotive or the computer itself, whatever we're talking about, and you're trying to explain to them and they were to laugh at you, you would be able to destroy them and cause everything that they're saying to age incredibly poorly just because you understand things that they don't understand yet. So I encourage you to take these looks because all technological upgrades have switching costs. For new technology to become emergent, old technology has to die, and this paradigm shift we're coming into is, like all paradigm shifts, is very difficult for human brains. So either it's a Ponzi scheme and a bubble, whatever we want to call it, or Bitcoin is the fastest paradigm shift in human history. If this is the case, few people are ready and few will adapt in time. Mathematically speaking, the majority of people will not be prepared until it is the final moments. And at that point, it's going to be incredibly fast and incredibly difficult because, again, Bitcoin is growing faster than the internet. It's a piece of software. It is very quick to upgrade to it and abandon everything else. And the majority of people are not going to be able to learn about it by the time it's taking over, and they're not going to even understand what's happening. So I encourage you to start learning about it, just in case the very crazy sounding Bitcoiners like myself are right, because if we're right, you are almost certainly not going to have time to let your brain adapt to once this thing gets going. And it's not because you're unintelligent, it's not because you're stupid. In fact, if you're watching this video, you're probably very, very smart and way ahead of the curve. It's simply a matter of human brains are locked in linear thinking, and we cannot keep up with the exponential pace of technology. And so the only way to keep up is to force your brain to adapt to exponential thinking and to be open to new technologies in this form of thinking. So I encourage you to take the orange pill, that is Bitcoin, and then hopefully as soon as possible, once you understand Bitcoin, to get off zero.